Hey, PreSales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I'm going to be joined by Garin Hess, author of Selling is Hard, Buying is Harder, How Buyer Enablement Drives Digital Sales and Shortens the Sales Cycle. Garin is also the CEO and founder of Consensus. The topic of today's episode is how a buyer enablement approach to deal review improves forecasting. I just love the topic of this podcast because it has so many different things that I love to talk about. Let's talk about buyer enablement. Let's talk about deal review. Let's talk about forecasting. And recently, we've had a number of episodes around deal review and forecasting and champion building. And so today's episode, we're putting it all together. If you haven't read Garin's book, I highly suggest it. And Garin has joined the PreSales Collective on many occasions, including this podcast to talk about buyer enablement. But today, we're getting more into the details of buyer enablement as it relates to the sales cycle and as it relates to forecasting deals. Garin provides some great insights on how we should be looking at coaching buyers in the sales cycle. So whether you're an account executive, you're a solutions consultant, you're a solutions leader, or aspiring pre-sales professional, this podcast is so interesting to hear as we talk about buyer enablement from the start of the process to the end of the process. Enjoy.
Today's episode is sponsored by Consensus. Scale your pre-sales organization and deliver better experiences with intelligent demo automation. Experience an interactive video demo at goconsensus.com.
Hi there, my name is Yuji Higashi, co-founder of PreSales Collective, and I have big news to share with you if you're a pre-sales leader or an individual contributor early in your career. We recently launched 2 training and enablement programs aimed at helping you take your career to the next level. Both programs were created by pre-sales leaders with input from dozens of SC veterans across our community. Now, we'll be running cohorts each month, so if you're interested in participating, visit us at presalescollective.com/enablement to submit an inquiry, and we'll send you details about each program, including this curriculum and schedule. We look forward to working with you on growing your career and being part of your career journey. Thank you, and I hope to see you soon.
Garin, welcome back to the PreSales Podcast. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks, James. It's great to be back on the show.
I love talking to you because I'm a huge fan of your book. I talk about it all the time. And I think this concept of buyer enablement is just so interesting, especially as it relates to the pre-sales and solutions profession. So I'm excited to get into it today. But before we get there, Garin, for those who maybe don't know about your journey, can you share your career experience? What got you to where you are today?
Well, it's a long story. I'll try to make it really brief, but I've been building technology companies for the last 20 years, but my whole career has been in enterprise software. And I first got introduced to sales engineering in my early 20s when I actually was in the training department for training customers. And the company didn't have sales engineers, but I was the most knowledgeable person on the product in the company. And I kept getting pulled into these sales conversations and consultative conversations. I didn't realize I was doing sales engineering at the time, but I was. And then they started hiring sales engineers and I started training them to do what I was doing, and then later I learned, oh, this was sales engineering. So that experience plus a lot of others and being involved in enterprise sales, B2B sales for many decades led to just these questions about what is the most effective way to get from the point where the buyers are digging in and trying to understand how you can help them to the point where they're actually getting value. It's a puzzle. It's a very complex puzzle. And, there are many experiences I've had, but one of them I would say happened many years ago in my previous startup. And we were dealing with a pretty good sized buying group. It was taking demo after demo and call after call. And I just kept thinking, what is going on? This is just taking way too long. And of course, the more time it took, the more worried I was getting about the deal. And I just kept thinking about the complexity that the buying group brings to getting a purchase decision made. And that led over time to the research and everything that eventually resulted in the book and the approaches that I advocate for.
I love the journey. And I do hear that the rumor of how sales engineering started was that product managers were getting pulled into calls and then they became SCs. Let's get into today's topic, Garin, because we have such an interesting conversation ahead. Today's topic is how a buyer enablement approach to deal review improves forecasting. There are so many important things in this title that I want to dissect today. Let's start with the baseline for the audience, especially for those who are not familiar. How do you, Garin, define buyer enablement?
Well, there's been a lot of discussion about buyer enablement lately. And one of the reasons I think it's important to define this baseline up front is because the more popular a term becomes, sometimes the less defined it becomes, because people who start using it that don't actually know what they're talking about.
Sounds like product-led growth right now.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. I think that fundamental to buyer enablement is that it's not just how you help the buyer. Buyer enablement at its most simplest form is making buying easier, right? The easier you make buying, the more likely they are to buy, the faster it's going to happen. But then the question is, how do you do that? And fundamental is that you have to sell through your champion to the other stakeholders in the buying group. It's not just how do we make this buying easier for the champion, it's how do we make it easier for all the different stakeholders in the buying group. As we all know, the buying group's getting larger, so it's never been more important. That's how I would define it, is how do you enable your champion to go discover, engage, and what do you equip them with to sell to that buying group internally on your behalf? You're the coach, you're coaching them through it.
I love your definition. And recently on the podcast, we've had some guests come on to talk about champion building and pipeline and forecasting and its role with solutions. How would you describe the fundamental difference in a buyer enablement approach to sales versus the traditional sell?
It's a great question. A lot of times people say, well, when you sell, you've got to keep the buyer in mind. And while that's true, buyer enablement is selling with the buyer's mind. It's not keeping them in mind. You have to have the buyer's mind. There's just a fundamental shift, first of all, in terms of how you perceive the whole process. Is it about what you're doing, or is it about what the buyers have to get done? And again, not just your champion, what does he or she have to get done, but what does every stakeholder in the buying group have to accomplish? And where does there have to be alignment across the whole group to get it done? So there's this fundamental approach of I've got to sell through the champion rather than I've got to go discover all of those stakeholders and go do that myself. The complex sale has been around for a long time. I like to say there's no such thing as a complex sale. There's only a complex purchase. It's a fundamental difference in perspective, right? But when you think about the complex sale, everybody's thinking about, multiple stakeholders, different decision makers and whatever. And that's not like that's a new concept. But what I think is fundamental is just how you effectively first define and discover your champion. And that's its own thing. 2, how do you know which stakeholders have to get involved? How do you discover and engage them? How do you equip them? And then there's this role of technology, obviously, in the whole process, which is how do you do this faster and more effectively than we used to do it? It's a model through which you can apply to digital selling.
Wonderful thoughts, Garin. There's so many things to unpack there. And, I've been no stranger to talk about B2C buying behaviors bleeding into B2B. I've been talking about it for a couple of years, and I think I was fortunate to be at Showpad when we were kind of learning about these trends and how it changed my approach as a solutions consulting and solutions engineering leader. But I want to ask you a couple controversial questions here, because as someone who's pretty involved and active on LinkedIn, I'm always looking for thought-provoking conversations. And recently, I saw a bit of a thread from what seemed like a lot of enterprise and experienced sellers kind of knocking this idea of buyer enablement. And some of the comments that resonated with me were, well, buyers need sellers. They need to be told what to do. They need to be told how to buy. Is that contradictory to your approach and a position on buyer enablement, or is it similar?
I actually think it's fundamental to buyer enablement. So fundamental to buyer enablement is an assumption that the selling team knows more about the buying process than the buying team. So you think about who's been through the buying process more. The selling team has guided thousands, as a collective group, thousands of customers and buyers through the buying process. So who knows more about the potential pitfalls, the questions, objections, the risks, the rewards than the selling team? The problem is that a lot of sellers think that the buyers know best. They'll say things like, so, Mr. Buyer, what do you think is the best next step? And the buyer's like, well, they'll come up with something, but it's not going to be the best thing most likely because they don't really know. they're very enthusiastic. Champions are enthusiastic. They're risk takers. They're willing to put their neck out, but they don't really understand the best way to get things done when it comes to the buying process. So I would agree with that. And this is where I see some of the definition of buyer enablement taking a wonky turn. Some people talk about buyer enablement as just put everything out there for the buyers, just give them everything that you can give them and let them figure it out because they know best. I do disagree with that. I don't think they know best. In fact, time and time again, I've seen buying group after buying group completely faceplant, a champion after champion faceplant, if they're not coached effectively, if they're not guided. In my book, I advocate strongly for leadership. Too many salespeople passively let the buyer decide how this buying process is going to go. And really the seller, which I would say we have to start calling them buying coaches, right? Buying coach needs to be saying, hey, champion, at this point in the buying process, here's what usually happens. And here's the kind of people who need to get involved. Here are the problems they're going to have with what you're trying to do. And here's how we're going to need to work through that. I think you should do X, Y, and Z. Does that sound good to you? You're leading them through. So I don't see that resistance to the idea of buyer enablement as a conflict. I think it's fundamental to buyer enablement. Where I see the problem in that discussion is if there are people that think that buyer enablement is just allowing the buyers to do whatever and putting stuff out there. I do think giving buyers resources is good, but without the coaching that both solution consultants and sales reps do in the process, buyers can get stuck. Now, can technology play a role and do some of that coaching? Sure, can help with that. But in a complex purchase, they're still going to need connections. But you can get a lot of that done in small business or commercial sales. But in complex purchases, they're going to need that coaching.
As you provided that answer, I'm thinking back to the comments and what I read in that conversation. And you're right. The root of it is a misunderstanding of what buyer enablement actually means. I've always had a philosophy that the difference between phenomenal, great, good, average, and below average salespeople, there's a big gap. And if you think about the best salespeople you've ever worked with, they know the process, they know the pitfalls, they know if their champion's saying something that is actually not going to happen, right? They think that they have signing approval, but they don't. And that is the difference, in my opinion, between the best salespeople that I've ever worked with and average and mediocre salespeople.
Yeah. And I would say on top of having that knowledge and understanding, the best ones also coach. And by coach, I mean, they make a recommendation and ask for a commitment. Because if the buyer isn't willing to take the coaching or take action on those commitments, they're not really an effective champion. And I've seen this at our own organization. We have a couple of different customers. They're both large companies. One has a champion that just storms through his entire organization, advocating in every possible way. The other one is so risk averse that he doesn't want to make waves, right? It's like they're both cheerleaders, but only one of them is a true champion. And that's the big difference is if they're willing to make commitments and stick to their commitments, then you've got your champion.
I think that sounds like a blog article if it isn't already, cheerleaders versus champions, because I think that's a very big difference.
I call it out in the book, but yeah, a lot of people don't make that clear in their minds. And consequently, they think they have a champion when all they have is a cheerleader.
So one question before we start getting into the forecasting and deal perspective, especially as it relates to process. We're talking about the process a lot. And I feel like a lot of times when I hear about a sales process, it feels very rigid. And there's like steps that you have to go through because, maybe our Salesforce or CRM is telling us, hey, you need to do this before you do that. But I think we know that buying isn't always exactly a linear process. It can be dynamic. It can have linear components to it, but is fairly dynamic. And so what's your opinion really on equipping your buying coaches, salespeople to be linear in a process that works for the organization for predictability, yet dynamic enough to effectively move somebody through a sales cycle?
This could be a completely separate topic, but it is a highly recursive process, the buying process, and definitely not linear, even though there is overall linear flow. It eventually has to move along the process, but it is not just moving from stage to stage. My recommendation is, first of all, you've got to map out your different stakeholders in the buying group for that product line and that market segment or whatever it is that you're selling. And you've got to understand when it is in the process that they typically get involved. And the easiest thing is just early, mid, late. And then what is their role? What are they trying to accomplish? What's their task, the job they have to get done at that stage, each stakeholder? And then you ask yourself, what do I need to give the champion to help them help that other stakeholder accomplish whatever that is? You do try to line that up in the buying group map in a type of a linear way, but because you understand that this is typically how it happens, when it happens atypically, and maybe certain stakeholders get engaged earlier than they normally do or whatever, you can still address that and just look at your buying group map and address that on the fly, I guess. So you basically have to have all these pieces, both the map, the stakeholder personas, the different pieces of content, whether it's case studies, ROI calculators, interactive video demos, or whatever it is. You're going to have all of these put together, and then you are the facilitator. You're connecting this information with them. And that's where all the coaching comes in. And you're funneling all that through your champion, usually, unless you're lucky enough to get direct access to the stakeholders.
Very well said, Garin. I really appreciate that approach. I want to shift the conversation a little bit to deals and forecasting deals. As a solutions leader, I have a fortunate background that I was pretty involved in pipeline and forecasting and progression as a solutions leader for most of my career. I've got a lot of opinions about forecasting and these types of topics. It's one of the most difficult things in sales, right? And I always respected and loved working with people who are great at forecast accuracy. I'm curious, right? As we're talking about great sellers and the process, is there a specific approach to, predicting and forecasting deals that you would take if you're coming from, a buyer enablement model or buyer enablement perspective?
Absolutely. And there are two fundamental aspects to this. First of all, you have to remember that if you're selling with the buyer's mind and you're thinking about the tasks they have to accomplish, that's a key. And I'll come back to that. And the other one is the buying group. So you have to ask yourself this question: is the buyer accomplishing the tasks they need to accomplish? And do I have all the stakeholders discovered? And are they accomplishing all the tasks they need to accomplish? So most deal review discussions currently go something like this. So the sales leader says, hey, tell me the deals that are in play, right? And so the sales rep or the solution consultant, however they're engaged, okay, well, on this deal, I've done some needs analysis, I've given a demo, and I've addressed their objections and concerns. I've sent them a proposal, and they said they like it. And I think we're in good shape. Right now, I don't see any major obstacles. So I give this 80% chance. And they're like, yeah, okay, sounds good. But the problem with that is none of that looks at what is the buyer actually doing and are they accomplishing the things they need to accomplish, nor does it look at all the different stakeholders. There's a whole set of recommendations I make in the book on how to actually measure this and metrics and things and how to actually come up with percentage scoring on risk. So as an example, and I'll say you can also put these into the CRM. So even in our own CRM that we use, we have a report that we can run on any deal that will show the actions that the buyer has to take to get the deal done and have they taken them or not. And even though we have our sales stages, we have this other report that looks at it kind of in a cross-section way that allows you to look at what the buyers are doing. And I'll give a shout out to Kevin Davis, who wrote Sales Manager's Guide to Greatness. He was the first one that put this idea in my head because he actually recommends you change your whole CRM from a sales funnel to a buying funnel. And you don't have sales stages in your CRM. You have buying stages, which I think is a good idea. In any case, if you just ask yourself the question, what do they have to get done and what stakeholders have to get involved? Then ask yourself in your deal review, are you talking about those two things? And if you're not, then you're really missing a lot of the point, because if you can blindly go down this path of we've done this and we've done that, and people are telling us great things and we think it's gonna work great, but that could all fall apart because you haven't analyzed the risk of the buying group, both from who's involved and who isn't involved and the tasks they need to accomplish, and did they get them accomplished and are they aligned?
I mean, that's a phenomenal perspective. And I'm actually sitting here reflecting on my career. I'm having a little bit of nightmares on forecasting and predictability in the example that you gave.
Yeah, they're difficult.
It is. It just gets me thinking about defining what best looks like. That's something that we are trying to focus on as PreSales Collective. And, I'm curious, as you're talking about deal reviews, do you have a story or a specific example that you can share with us that really defines like how this comes to life?
Before I tell the story, what I'd like to suggest is some questions that people can ask in a deal review. There's also reports you ought to be putting together, like matrix reports that show your stakeholders down the left and the tasks they need to accomplish or different things. You can find all these in the book. But some of the common questions that I ask if I'm talking to a technical selling team is like, what has the champion done so far to promote the deal internally? How's the champion demonstrating that they're going to take the risks necessary to get the purchase completed? Another one is, how's the champion responding to your coaching? In what ways have you equipped the champion so far? And how have they used those resources? How many stakeholders are discovered? I mean, here's just a really simple one. If you want to do a simple risk analysis from a buyer enablement approach on a deal, you just say, how many stakeholders are involved in this deal? How many stakeholders normally have to get involved to get the deal done? Just that difference will tell you something that you may not have looked at before. So another one is, have you found a stakeholder for each persona in the buying group profile for that product and segment? Are there any missing? And then do you have every stakeholder engaged, and questions around that? So along those lines, the story that I'd love to share is actually a story I put in my book. The story doesn't come from my own experience, even though I have some to share, but I love this particular story, and you'll see why. It's from a book called The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. And it's a landmark book for entrepreneurs. It's a great book in a lot of ways. But it has this one interesting story about Ben Horowitz's VP of sales doing a deal review. And this is how he says, I'll just read this little section here. He says, we held a weekly forecast call where Mark, who's the VP of sales, reviewed every deal in front of the entire 150-person sales force. On one such call, a salesperson described an account that he'd forecasted in detail. I have buy-in from my champion, the vice president that he reports to, and the head of purchasing. My champion assures me that they'll be able to complete the deal by the end of the fiscal quarter. And Mark quickly replied, have you spoken to the vice president's peer in the networking group? Sales rep, no, I haven't. Mark, have you spoken to the vice president yourself? Sales rep, no. Mark, okay, listen carefully. Here's what I'd like you to do. First, reach up to your face and take off your rose-colored glasses. Then get a Q-tip and clean the wax out of your ears. Finally, call the blankety-blank vice president right now because you do not have a deal. And then Ben Horowitz goes on to say, Mark was right. It turned out that we did not have a deal as the vice president's peer in the networking was blocking it. So my point in this story is just to say that this vice president understood that it's the stakeholders in the buying group that matter most. You either get it done with them, but you can't get it done without them, right? They're either going to be with you or they're going to block you. And if you're not fully in tune, now that sales rep that he was talking to didn't necessarily understand, but that's the point. You may not, as a solution consultant or as a sales rep, you may not understand, but your leaders do. The best sellers on your team do. Other more experienced people do. So you've got to get that group together and disseminate this information about what types and roles have to get involved. You know what? Let me just share, if you don't mind, just one other story that is personal. It's more of a horror story. And this is back when at Consensus, we were raising our first priced round for financing. And we had a growth equity firm. This was back in, I think, 2015, late 2015. We had a growth equity firm just give us this, what looked like a sweetheart deal. We had it all in writing. We got the term sheet signed. We're going down our 90-day path to get the deal finalized and the funding that we needed. And we were literally 3 days before the funding to close. We were literally in red lines on the legal contract. And my main contact over at the growth equity firm said, hey, we're pulling out of this deal. And I said, what is going on? And it was a terrible timing too, because I was in Vegas and I was supposed to go on stage and promote Consensus in front of this audience of like 200 people. And he called me an hour before, I said, what's happening? He goes, well, there's one limited partner that just doesn't like the deal. And I said, before we even signed the term sheet, I already asked you if all the investment committee had signed off on it. He said, well, they all did, except this guy was out of the country and we couldn't get a hold of him. And the whole thing fell apart. And literally 3 days before we were supposed to get the funding. And that left us with like 8 weeks of cash left and all this. It was a challenging time. In a sense, it was a sales process, even though I hadn't really looked at it that way previously. And there were stakeholders that I was not aware of that needed to get involved. And because I didn't know about them, I would have predicted a 98% chance that thing was closing at that point 3 days before. I mean, we were nitpicking over red lines. Anyway, so there's a couple stories.
I appreciate you sharing those stories. I mean, they're both very impactful. Big fan of Ben Horowitz, and hearing that story, I'm sure we all can relate to an experience like that. I can't help but mention that I feel like you going through that experience probably helped you further validate your own approach to business and buyer enablement and consensus as a product, because that was exactly what you're talking to.
Yeah. And I've seen that happen on product sales as well, but that was probably the most painful one because it was, in essence, we were selling a part of our company to the investors and, the deal didn't go through. And thankfully, all's well that ends well. We found a great alternative investment partner and here we are today. But yeah, it was painful at the time.
I appreciate you sharing that experience. As we talk about consensus specifically, I think what I've really enjoyed is I've got a front row seat with the PreSales Collective to seeing consensus grow and talking to members who are utilizing it. Can you talk a little bit more about consensus, especially as it relates to demo automation and how demo automation is playing a role into this forecast conversation?
It's been so interesting to see. Demo automation allows you to engage your stakeholders in a digital way that we didn't used to be able to do. And so as an example, the interactive video demos that consensus users will send out, the solution consultants and sales reps will send out, they are engaged initially with by the champion, but then there are different elements of the interactive demo that invites them to share it with others. And as they share it with others, they each get a personalized experience in the process, and that makes them even more inclined to share it with others. I mean, case in point was there's a large multinational firm that started in an APAC team in Korea. I sent him, the head of pre-sales there, a demo in February. He started sharing it. Eventually, 26 different people shared it with other people inside the org. And you could see, we had, I think, 17 people from pre-sales, 9 people from sales, this kind of thing. And so then you ask yourself, do those kind of analytics give you a higher predictor of a purchase? If you see 26 people engaging and personalized content like that, right? So that's just an example. You can use demo automation to both equip your champion for the purpose of discovering stakeholders, but then the data you get by observing their engagement is what helps you understand how more likely they are to make a purchase. So that's how that plays in.
That's fascinating. I love the use of data and technology to help move this really tough process along. Garin, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I always enjoy speaking with you and getting your perspective on buyer enablement. So thanks for joining me today and keep up the great work.
Thank you, James. It's been a pleasure.
All right, PreSales Collective. I wish I could have talked to Garin for 90 minutes on this topic. I wanted to ask so many follow-up questions, but I wasn't able to today. One of the first things that Garin mentioned was that buyer enablement is making buying easier, selling through champions. And he talked about the difference of cheerleaders to champions. And that just really was a light bulb moment for me, because as I think about deal progression and deal strategy, having that champion and selling through that champion to ensure they have what they need to buy your software is critically important. If I reflect back on my own sales experience over the past decade, these aren't really conversations that came up very often, right? We weren't in forecasting deals talking about champions enough. It may have been one question, maybe 2 questions from sales leaders, but not always the level of depth that Garin talks about as it relates to deal progression. Sales is hard, and I really appreciate Garin's perspective as it relates to the account executive conversation that I've seen recently. And in the middle of the podcast, Garin provided some really great questions to ask as it relates to forecasting. And so my challenge for any solutions leader out there who's looking for advice on how to play a bigger role in pipeline management, learn those questions and start asking those questions. It could be in a big deal review. It can be in a one-on-one with a salesperson. It can be one-on-one with the account executive or one-on-one with the sales leader. I think understanding the buyer's mind is critically important for buyer enablement. And as buying begins to shift, we as sales and solutions engineers and the entire sales team or buying coaching team, we need to be able to educate buyers to get to that purchase. And I believe if solutions teams are looking for a bigger role and more accountability and responsibility within an organization, getting involved here at the deal strategy is critically important. I've been no stranger to say that sales is changing. B2C buying behavior is bleeding into B2B. The number of people that are involved in a buying decision has just increased year over year. So we need everything that we can get to enable us to be able to get to a sale. And change in a sales process or changing a salesperson's approach is really hard, and it's not going to happen overnight. And so being better equipped to have these conversations, to be strategic, to make sure deals close is critically important to our organizations. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget, you can always check out the Member Hub to learn the latest and greatest of what's happening around the PreSales Collective. Our Leader Elevate and Foundations programs are live, or our Leadership Next and Executive Summit are happening in October and November of this year. I just hope to see you around. Thank you so much for your support, and I will see you next week.